Please welcome Chris Swisher.
Hi, everybody. Actually, for the record, not Chief Engineer at Telemundo, Director of Production Systems Engineering for NBCU. And if anybody else wants to borrow my slides for a future presentation, just come see me afterward. I got a standard release form. Where are we here? Telemundo Center. Okay, so I thought I'd start with a warm memory for us all to share, the era of fully mature SDI video technology. What a time, huh? We had robust metal cables, connectors indifferent to dust. We had multiplexers, we had DAs, we had frame syncs. Everything did one thing and did it well. You could look at a single line diagram and understand what it was supposed to do, right? Every box had gazoutas and gazintas, and it was a great time to be a video engineer. So I offer this really to tee up what I thought would be an interesting thought experiment. Jeff sort of referenced this as a potential, counterfactual history here. What would it have been like to build Telemundo Center as an SDI plant? So for a start, we would have had local source devices wired with familiar jack field and DA type infrastructure, directly wired to dedicated production switchers and dedicated local routers per control room. And again, as he mentioned, we have 5 full-size control rooms here at Telemundo Center. We would have needed additional routers for studios, again, 13 studios here, the post-edit environment, transmission, all connected via core. What would that have left us with? Well, I call it the tangled web. So we would have had, this complex network of small router systems with limited interconnectivity, extremely limited capacity for resource sharing, flexibility between control rooms, sharing of resources and devices. Coax distance limitations likely would have forced us to build local equipment rooms housing this equipment for each production control room, which from a building, construction and architecture perspective would have further reinforced legacy ways of doing production business. We would have had a locked infrastructure. Now, some of you may know that basically what I've described here is actually the video architecture that we inherited at 30 Rock, where I do most of my job. We were very lucky here at Telemundo Center to be able to do this from scratch as a greenfield build, not so lucky up there. So what was that greenfield build? What did we actually do? So we took all the devices involved in the production environment and connected them to one single IP production router. That includes all your CCUs, graphics devices, DDRs, and every port of the production switcher itself. So that forms a shared back-end pool. Then the front end for studios and control rooms also connected to that. That's principally monitoring. So essentially, we here, instead of having these sort of locked islands of complete production control environments, we have this now split between the pooled back end and the lightweight front end. Transmission, ingest, and post-production areas are connected to a separate IP router we call the acquisition system, and those two are interconnected with managed tie lines of enough capacity that they're essentially transparent to the operation. So what did this get us? A SMPTE 2110 network is a lot of numbers you can use to describe this. I like to think of it as a 13,000 squared 3 gig switching capability network. That's the equivalent of 12 SDI routers at 1152. So what does this mean? So flat physical connectivity enables unlimited flexibility. A large fiber optic infrastructure here, which is, we can talk all day about that, enabled us to, instead of having these local equipment rooms, we have everything housed in a single central equipment room for the whole plant. And then at each production area, each production control room and studio, we have a much more slimmed down local fiber termination or demarcation point. In short, IP-enabled elastic infrastructure for Telemundo Center. Okay, so some lessons we learned from this. A couple of things I want to go through here. Things about network architecture, Encap and Decap, presentation of these resources to the production operations. What's missing? What do we need? You've heard some of those things already. And finally, some final thoughts on managing complexity in this environment. All right, so lessons about network architecture. 1, redundancy. Redundancy is a gift of IP, and it should be enjoyed. I wouldn't recommend that anyone try to embark on a large-scale IP build anything close to this nature without using a redundant network infrastructure. I would caution that you do need to be careful about making sure that you're managing it properly, and don't get comfortable with the idea that one link or the other is down, right? Because if you lose the source side X link and the destination side Y link, the redundancy starts to fall down pretty quickly. Network diversity. Look, guys, it is okay to have different networks doing different things, okay? Place we really see that here most notably is with our production audio mixers in the control rooms. Those essentially straddle 3 different networks. There's a 2110 network, a Ravenna network for studio and IFB connectivity, and the Dante network for the intercom and other stuff like that. While it certainly is an exciting possibility to merge those all into one, there's never a scenario where you need to route a studio mic into a production switcher, right? So if you have an architecture that demands your ability to do that, I think you need to, consider that carefully. Final thought along those same lines, even within the 2110 environment, it's okay to have segmentation. I mentioned here we've got the acquisition and production systems. Functionally, they feel like a single flat environment. It is not technically truly non-blocking, but building a truly non-blocking network at this scale may be, impractical or cost prohibitive. And it's okay to allow systems to have affinities within their own non-blocking matrix where appropriate. All right, Encap and Decap. So this one gets a little bit heady. It was an important lesson for me that I really got out of the build here, and which I can basically summarize as follows. Every IP de-encapsulation is a unique event, and every various endpoints may perform that event differently in a couple of different ways. Audio-video sync, seamless switching, hitless merge. These are the key examples. So you look at audio-video sync, when a 2110 was in an SDI environment, right, video with embedded audio travel as a single interleaved stream. However, in 2110, right, where you have separate video and audio multicasts, those multicasts are reunited and synchronized, in our case here using PTP, separately at each endpoint. And different endpoints may perform that differently. So if we look at the seamless switching example, there's a really good example of this here at Telemundo Center. So we have a workflow in the production path where we basically build a virtual 2x1 switch with virtual router reentries, okay? So if this were an SDI 2x1 switch, either a physical box or a switched router output, we would have every expectation that any downstream receiver of that stream would show the same exact thing. Not so in IP. Actually, what we experience here is that the endpoints feeding the actual air release chain perform that hit seamlessly, that switch seamlessly, but the multiviewers in the control room show a glitch. So this, it was a bit of an education to help people understand that when you see that glitch on the monitor wall, it's okay, right? Air is secure, but this does reveal something, I think, deep and meaningful about IP video. I like to say it's even less analog than digital was. We can sort of imagine that certain video streams have some real existence out on that network, but really a route event is more accurately understood as a set of instructions for a device to perform some tasks. And, like I say, they may do it differently. Okay, operational presentation. So again, like we've been saying, all the devices in the production chain are connected to the same one router. So what we can't do is just give the control room an XY panel and say, give them with great power comes great responsibility speech and sneak out the back door. That wasn't going to work for us here. So what did we do? Here at Telemundo Center, we make extensive use of virtual loopback routing to match physical resources to localized control room virtual resources. The sort of simplest spirit of this is that you don't want to ask a director to call cam 43 today, ready cam 5 tomorrow, ready cam 19. Every control room needs to have its own cam 1. We assign physical resources to those local loopbacks on the back end. We have not come anywhere near to flexing all the muscle that this pooled back end offers us. What we've done here is, you can sort of think of it as simulating that locked, legacy SDI environment within the elastic pooled environment. And that's an important first step for like a V1 of an IP facility like this. It's, by analogy to the transition from hardware appliances to virtual computing, we would call this the lift and shift stage. Okay, and we have only the rest of our careers to improve upon this over time, but we've laid the groundwork with the flat physical infrastructure that we can support any more exotic recombinations of these in the future. Okay, so what's missing? I think a lot of this stuff you already heard. Fern already mentioned a few of these things, but I think it's important to reiterate them. So, endpoint control standards. I've had over the last few years as we've been doing these IP builds, I keep having this same conversation over and over again, where I'll ask a vendor, I say, I'd love to use the IP, whatever, the 2110 board in your device. Do you work with my control system? And the answer is always yes, we do, just as soon as we get NMOS. The stream subscription problem is real in 2019. Aside from stream subscription itself, there's other related questions about how we perform the switching event. Is it seamless? Is it synchronous? Is it break before make? Are we reserving bandwidth to make before break? All of this needs to settle down before we can really mature IP video infrastructure to the next level. Another one, again, Fern went into this in some detail, so I won't belabor it, but audio improvements in the way we manage audio bundling. He referred to, I think, with audio grooming was the term there. We refer to that here as the shredder. Subsystems responsible for taking in multi-channel audio, multicast, tearing them apart, putting them back together. Again, that is complex and, in some cases, unwieldy. Another thing that's sort of in that same universe too is I look forward to being able to do anything interesting with that ancillary data multicast. Today, we basically just treat that as a rider with the video, with the video multicast, and assume that they're always going to go together. But I look forward to the day when we can have devices that are spitting out just data streams that we can layer onto video, stack different kinds of ancillary data together. That's an exciting time for me. Finally, always on the move toward better, smarter control systems. The way we architected this sort of, virtual PCR local router concept with the virtual loopbacks it's largely organic here, driven by a combination of salvos and sort of operator-driven, day of routing. There's room for us to improve the facility with better, smarter control systems that allow orchestration intelligence to do things that we can't do with our organic solution today. Okay, final thoughts, managing complexity. So we saw this guy earlier, SDI signal flow. You can read this drawing from left to right and understand what it's supposed to do. And that's because in an SDI environment, we made workflow decisions at the time of system design and rendered them in metal. So you could have a broad expectation that, you wire it up like this, and when you turn it on, it's more or less going to work as expected. In IP, it's a little more complicated, right? We basically just plug everything into the router and figure it out later, okay? There's tremendous power associated with that. I don't need to belabor that point, but sort of the net impact of this is that SDI plant would have extremely complex wiring with relatively simple configuration. An IP plant, by contrast, has more or less simple wiring, but very complex configuration. And this is a really important lesson for anyone to understand who's about to embark on an IP build. From just a bare project timeline perspective, you need to give a lot more runway between the conclusion of physical integration and the start of operational readiness than you did in an SDI plant. I think it's also important to not do what I just said, which is plug it all in and figure it out later, but try to front load as much as possible the your expectations of the workflow across that IP environment. Like Jeff said, here it's most accurate to say that IP came first and the workflow came later. But I sometimes think about how much farther we could have pushed things if we were able to front load more of that configuration work and the mental sweat associated with what it takes to get that done. We could have driven the functionality of this place even farther. That's it for me. I want to now hand it over to David Potter from Intoto Systems. You may remember him from his Blink and You'll Miss It cameo on one of Jeff's videos. He's going to take us into a bit of a deep dive on some of the actual techniques and strategies that we put together in order to do that configuration and change management stuff here at Telemundo Center. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi there. So again, David Potter, Intoto Systems. We were fortunate enough to be able to support Telemundo in the deployment of this system and help them build the systems that they use to manage some of that virtual complexity. So I'll go into some details around that at describing what some of those elements of complexity are, and then give you some details around the systems that we deployed to manage that. In describing the types of complexity, I guess I'm going to focus on two. The first is, I think, the router table. You heard that we had about 13,500 signals for the way that we measure it. And each one of those has a lot of metadata associated with it. What control panels are allowed to access that source or that destination, how it's presented to the operator, what categories it's put under, various names, operational names, engineering names. All in all, I think we had about 90,000 points of metadata to manage here. A huge operational, that's just a very, very large number of names. And then in terms of salvos, Jeff had a really great slide, I think you saw, where they were showing the schedule for PCR5 and how they have to be able to flip PCR5 6 times in a day. Those flips are really complex. We are reconfiguring not only the wiring inside of the virtual wiring inside the control room during one of those flips, but also connections to the studio, engineering and diagnostic. All of that is represented currently in salvos. And we're going to talk a little about the complexity during commissioning of the system at managing those salvos, and then during operations as salvo changes are needed. I think it became really clear really fast that to Telemundo that they needed to have kind of a meta control layer. And so we brought in some technologies that have been successful in web and tech industries to help manage that. So let's talk about during commissioning of the system. So we had a very large router table, highly dynamic, with a lot of different engineers that needed access to that router table. About 20 engineers that were making changes regularly to the table and needed visibility to it. And then in the salvo world, all of the new technical capabilities that you've heard described by Jeff and Chris and Fernando drove new needs for salvos. So the salvos here are pretty complex. When we flip a control room from one show to another, I think we're doing about 350 router takes in the control room and another 250 or so between the control room and the studios. So that's a really substantial number of takes. And when a change is needed to that salvo, it doesn't affect just one salvo because it affects the principal salvos and then the same salvos for backup control rooms and a bunch of engineering and diagnostic salvos as well. So one change for Telemundo can, one operational request can have a lot of impact to a lot of different salvos. During operations, we see that, as I mentioned, one salvo change has to get synchronized out to all of the different control rooms. And the router table, at Telemundo, they use multiple control systems. We have a Lavo VSM control system and an Evertz Magnum system and several other ancillary systems as well. And any changes to these systems need to be reflected consistently across all of those systems. So If we make a change to a router table, change one of those 90,000 names, for example, or add a new signal, it's critical that everts and Lava VSM agree. Otherwise, communications between those systems may, we wouldn't have the expected operational actions taken when we execute a salvo. So, how did we address this? We brought in Devops processes that have been really successful in web and tech to manage these. So we started by saying we're going to have a single source of truth. The router table and salvos are defined in external systems, and I'm going to give you some technical details related to those. And the principal goal of that external system is to make them easy to edit, be a single place, so that our automation systems can take that router table or take those salvo definitions and export them into multiple different places consistently, quickly, and reliably. It provides the user with feedback during the editorial process to help them understand that they're entering the data correctly, that they're using correct router names, etc. And we're performing change control on all of those operations. So when a change is made to the router table or when a change is made to a salvo, that a user is identified as who made that change, when did they make it, why did they make it, what is the change, and that supports some roll forward, roll back that we'll talk about in a moment. We have automation then that takes that single source of truth when a change is made and generates configuration packages that can be released to the everts Magnum system here, the Lava VSM system, our ancillary control systems, documentation systems, support systems. And so all of those systems receive we're not migrating individual changes, we actually reconfigure the entire configuration for these systems and archive those so that they can be deployed at convenient times during operations. That we also support a workflow, an engineering workflow, so that after changes are made, engineers can review those changes prior to deployment into production as well. And then finally, we use a kind of a semi-automated deployment process. So after an engineer makes a change to some of to the router table or the salvo definitions or any part of this kind of complex configuration, the deployment packages are built, but they're not pushed into production until an engineer indicates that they want to do that. They use a Devops process that I'm going to describe in a moment for you to do that. But it's a single button push to deploy a new configuration into production. But we've segmented production into various domains so that the configuration can be pushed into an area of the production system that's available. So, for example, if a new salvo is created, that may impact a lot of different control rooms, but we can push that into control room 1 when control room 1 is available, and then into control room 4 when that's available later. So here are some of the technical details around that, and then I've got some screenshots, and we can talk through some of the. I can visualize these for you a little bit. So generally we use Excel. We use Excel for data entry. Excel is very good at data entry. It's easy to edit. It provides built-in data validation. It's available everywhere. So engineers, when they want to make a change to the router structure, or they want to make a change to a salvo, that's done directly in Excel. They commit those changes into a version control system. We use Git, which is a very common open source source code control system, and that provides all of the change tracking, that provides differentials so that it's really easy to see different versions and the changes between them, provides comments, and it's exceptionally easy to roll back to a previous configuration when it's needed or roll forward to a new configuration. We use Jenkins, an open source automation system, for all of the automation around building new configurations for our control systems. So that performs consistency verification. It builds those deployment packages, and it actually, when Telemundo decides to push a new configuration into production, it performs we call it a promotion. That's the actual push into production. The targets for that at this facility right now are Evertz Magnum, Lavo VSM, internal documentation systems, both for engineering and for operations. We have an operations portal here for salvo documentation. And there's some internal support systems that also receive that. And then the documentation systems in use here are almost entirely based on HTML, JavaScript, and some images. So there's a portal that either engineers or operations can go to, and they can see the current configuration of systems. They can also see impending changes so that they know they can review what they're going to deploy before they deploy it. So I'm going to talk through, here's an example of data entry. This is a salvo that we're looking at. Now, let me just kind of walk through this a little bit and tell you a little about what you're seeing here and illustrate some of the complexity. So this is a salvo for the connections between a control room and a studio. This actually isn't a salvo. Sometimes we call it a super salvo. It's actually defining a look for a show. In this case, it's Titulares y Más, which is a sports show. And that show has different looks. During Premier League Soccer, they have one look. During the rest of the season, they may have other looks. Some of the shows have looks and feels that vary depending on production features. Oh, we're doing a remote, or we have an in-studio interview, or things like that. We'll have a salvo for each one of those, but this super salvo actually kind of gets broken down into a lot of different salvos. So, like I said earlier, if we'll create one of these for each control room. So normally this production is out of control room 1, but in the event of a scheduling problem, they may move that into another control room. So every time we make a change to this salvo, it's really important that we reflect that in the salvos for every control room. And it's at this kind of scale, I think we have a total of about, right now, 600 to 800 salvos, if you count them individually. Each one of those, 200 to 600 routes that are made in the salvo. It's big. It's big, and it would be really, I think it would be very difficult to manage this without large amounts of automation. So in this particular salvo, what you're seeing on the left side is the normal source in a control room. So notice this, if I look at the first row here, this is coming out of Swisher Aux 1, and we're routing that to a virtual reentry called Studio Monitor 2. So from the control room's perspective, all they need to know is that they're routing this into Studio Monitor 2. Notice again, it says Swisher Aux 1. It doesn't say PCR1, Swisher Aux 1, because we're defining a look that should be deployable in every control room. We can then route that into, we currently aren't, but we can route that into a color processor, and then we go through a scalar input into a scalar output to another color processor, and finally to a BSP. So that's 6 routes for that signal, and this goes on. You do not see the entire salvo on the screen, so it's large. You see some green and some red, so as users are entering their data, if they make a typo, or if for any reason the system doesn't recognize the input that the user is putting in, it gives them that immediate feedback. Also, this system understands that different control rooms have some variations between them, both operational variations and infrastructure variations, and it will make those changes for the operator automatically. So after an operator makes a change to a salvo, they would then commit that using Git. And on the right-hand side here, you can see a Git history. This is actually showing the Jenkins build process and a history of changes. Change number 201. I can see the date that change was made. I can see who made it and a little bit about what that change involved. On the left side, you're seeing the Jenkins build process. And that is every time a new Git commit is submitted, we build all of those deployment packages for all the various systems. So you see that we're processing our router table. We are preparing packages for the engineering website. We're preparing packages for the engineering network shares, and we actually put copies of those on private Google Cloud for Telemundo. We are sending notifications to people who care about changes to these systems via email and a Slack channel. And then we are preparing files that can be imported directly into everts and into Lavo. And then we prepare, it says trigger deployment jobs. That's incorrect. We actually just prepare the deployment jobs. Here's a screenshot of the Telemundo documentation portal. This is used both by engineering and by operations. So a couple of examples. So the main screen on the left. On the right, we have some just web rendered views of the router table. These were used extensively during the commissioning process. I think less probably now that we're in operations. In operations, we see a lot fewer changes, of course, to the router table. During commissioning, the router table would change dozens of times a day. Now, I think it changes pretty infrequently. Here is an example of the Salvo portal. The Salvo documentation is used principally by it's used both by engineering and by operations. I would say principally by operations. So this allows operations to either see impending changes before they are promoted so that they can review and approve those, or they can see changes or they can see the state of the Salvo as it exists now. So again, on the left, we've taken one of those kind of super salvos and now we've rendered it specifically for PCR4. So you can see, again, you can read that kind of left to right and see all of the different takes that are involved in the salvo, and then we render that visually for the operator as well as a diagram. Great. Any comments or questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.